So Donald Trump just called out Canada, not Mark Carney, not the Canadian government, not a specific policy or a specific trade grievance or a specific diplomatic dispute. Canada, the country, the people, the nation itself, dismissed in a single statement from the White House briefing room as a failed state riding on America's back. A country that wouldn't last 6 months without American protection and American trade. A country whose citizens should be embarrassed by the leadership they keep, choosing a sitting American president just attacked the national identity of 38 million people, questioned the viability of an allied nation, and insulted an entire electorate for the crime of choosing leaders he doesn't like. And Mark Carney, the prime minister, whose measured, calculated, meticulously timed responses have defined 18 months of confrontation fired back within 90 minutes, not 90 days, not 90 hours, 90 minutes. The fastest retaliatory response in the history of the U.S.-Canada relationship, delivered with a speed that told the world this wasn't a reaction. It was a detonation protocol. A preloaded response activated the moment Trump crossed the one line that Carney had been waiting for him to cross. Within those 90 minutes, Canada announced the immediate cancellation of 12 bilateral agreements covering military procurement, agricultural trade, water sharing rights, and cross-border infrastructure. Canada imposed a 200% tariff on every category of American agricultural export entering the Canadian market. Effective at midnight, no phasing period, no exemptions. Canada formally invoked the Democratic Sovereignty Compact, triggering consultations with 17 allied nations on collective economic sanctions against the United States. And Carney delivered a televised address to the nation that was carried live by networks in 41 countries and that contained a single sentence so devastating in its simplicity that it broke the internet's own records for the fastest trending phrase in the history of the platform. Warren Buffett said Trump just triggered the one response that cannot be managed, cannot be negotiated, and cannot be reversed because attacking a country's identity doesn't produce a policy dispute. It produces a war of principle. And wars of principle don't end at the negotiating table. But it's what Carney said, 9 words delivered 90 minutes after Trump's statement, standing in front of a Canadian flag with 38 million citizens watching, that will outlast this crisis, this presidency, and this era. When you hear what Trump specifically said about Canada, why Carney's response came so fast, what the 90-minute timeline reveals about how prepared Canada was for this exact scenario, what the 12 canceled agreements mean for American military and agricultural interests, and what Buffett explains about the difference between attacking someone's interests and attacking their identity. You'll understand why this isn't another round of the trade war. This is the round that ended the relationship. Hit subscribe, because the compact consultation with 17 nations begins tomorrow, and what comes out of that consultation will reshape the Western alliance for a generation. Let me take you through exactly what Trump said, because the language matters. Not just the words he chose, but the target he chose and why. Targeting a country's identity rather than its leader or its policies represents a fundamentally different kind of provocation that produces a fundamentally different kind of response. Trump's statement was delivered during a scheduled press briefing in response to a reporter's question about the status of U.S.-Canada trade negotiations. The question was routine. The answer was not. Trump spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds, and in those 4 minutes, he did not attack Mark Carney. He did not criticize a specific Canadian policy, and he did not reference a specific trade grievance. He attacked Canada itself, the country, the concept, the national project. His exact words included, Canada is a failed state riding on America's back. They don't have a military. They don't have an economy without us. They don't have relevance without us. They sit up there above us on the map, collecting the benefits of being America's neighbor while contributing absolutely nothing to the partnership. He continued, the Canadian people should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed by the leaders they keep choosing, by the decisions those leaders keep making, and by the fact that their country, their entire country, only exists because the United States allows it to exist. Without us, Canada is a frozen parking lot with a flag, he added. And I think most Canadians know that. I think most Canadians in their hearts know that their country is a junior partner that got too big for its britches, and that everything they have, everything is a gift from the American people that can be taken back whenever we decide. The language was revealing in a way that previous provocations were not. Previous attacks targeted Carney, his leadership, his policies, his legitimacy. Those were attacks on a political figure, and political figures can be defended, criticized, and replaced within the normal mechanics of democratic politics. This targeted Canada, not the government, but the country, not the leader, but the people, not a policy, but a national identity. A failed state, a frozen parking lot with a flag, everything they have is a gift from the American people. The language was designed, whether consciously or through the instinct of a man who has spent decades understanding which words inflict maximum damage, to humiliate not a leader, but a nation, to make 38 million people feel small, to reduce 159 years of national history, democratic development, institutional achievement, and cultural identity to the status of an American dependency that exists at American pleasure. International reaction was immediate, and it was categorically different from the response to any previous provocation because the target was different. When Trump attacked Carney, allied governments defended Carney. When Trump attacked Canadian trade policy, allied governments criticized the tariffs. When Trump attacked Canadian sovereignty, allied governments condemned the interference. But when Trump attacked Canada itself, the country, the people, the national project, allied governments reacted with something closer to horror, because every government recognized instantly that if the United States could dismiss an allied nation as a failed state and a frozen parking lot with a flag, there was nothing preventing the same language from being directed at them. France's president responded within an hour, calling the statement an insult not to Canada, but to every nation that has ever been told it exists only because a larger nation permits it. Germany's chancellor issued a statement calling the language indistinguishable from the rhetoric historically used by imperial powers to justify the subjugation of smaller nations. Japan's prime minister called it deeply alarming and without precedent in the modern alliance system. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a warning that language which dehumanizes or delegitimizes entire national populations has historically preceded the most severe violations of international norms. It was a formal, restrained statement, yet it landed in a moment already saturated with tension. 90 minutes after the U.S. president's remarks, Mark Carney appeared on national television. The speed was the first signal. In previous phases of the 18-month confrontation, Canada's responses had been deliberate, measured in days or even weeks. Those intervals were not hesitation. They were part of a strategy signaling composure, control, and independence from American political tempo. This time there was no delay. 90 minutes was too fast for improvisation, which implied something more significant. The response had been prepared long before the trigger. A standing policy file waiting for a specific threshold to be crossed. Carney appeared in Ottawa, framed by a single Canadian flag. No podium, no parliamentary chamber, no assembled officials. The visual simplicity was intentional. This was not institutional theater. It was direct address leader to citizens and, by extension, nation to world. He began without force or embellishment. A few hours ago, the President of the United States called Canada a failed state. He called our country a frozen parking lot with a flag. He said everything we have is a gift from the American people and that we exist only because the United States allows it. A brief pause followed. I want to respond to that. Not with anger, though it exists, not with outrage, though it would be justified, but with facts. What followed was a structured, almost clinical dismantling of the claims. Canada's banking stability, healthcare coverage, public safety metrics, education performance, infrastructure ratings, and institutional trust indices were cited one after another. Each statement was delivered without commentary, as though reading from a balance sheet rather than delivering a political rebuttal. The tone was deliberate restraint, no emotional escalation, no rhetorical excess, only verification against record. Then came history. Canada, he noted, had existed as a self-governing nation for decades before major U.S. global military engagements. Canadian forces had fought in both world wars, including the Normandy landings, before the United States entered the European theater in the Second World War. The implication was not comparison, but continuity. Canada's existence and agency were not derivative of American approval. Canada does not exist because the United States allows it, he concluded. Canada exists because Canadians built it, defended it, and continue to sustain it. At that point, policy followed rhetoric. He announced the cancellation of 12 bilateral agreements spanning defense procurement, agricultural trade, water-sharing frameworks, cross-border infrastructure coordination, and regulatory harmonization. Each cancellation was grounded in a single premise. Agreements depend on mutual recognition. That recognition, he argued, had been publicly undermined, effective immediately. Canada also imposed a 200% tariff on American agricultural exports. The scale of the measure was not symbolic, it was structural. It would reshape trade flows overnight, particularly in regions of the United States dependent on Canadian markets. Next came the invocation of the Democratic Sovereignty Compact, triggering consultations among 17 allied nations. The mechanism was designed for coordinated response to perceived threats against member legitimacy. Its activation signaled escalation beyond bilateral dispute into multilateral alignment. The speech then shifted. Carney paused, looked directly into the camera, and moved away from policy language entirely. We are not a parking lot. We are a country. The sentence was simple, almost understated, but its effect was immediate. It reframed everything that had come before, not as retaliation, but as affirmation of identity. It was no longer about trade or tariffs or diplomacy. It was about recognition. Within minutes, the phrase spread globally. Within hours, it appeared on buildings, placards, and social media feeds across multiple continents. It functioned less as a slogan and more as a declaration, something stripped of complexity, meant to be repeated, not interpreted. Economic and political consequences followed quickly. American agricultural exports collapsed sharply in Canadian markets, driven not only by tariffs but by consumer withdrawal. Cross-border infrastructure systems entered legal uncertainty. Military procurement channels were disrupted. Supply chains that had taken decades to integrate suddenly lacked governing frameworks. At the same time, allied consultations under the compact moved rapidly toward coordinated measures. What had begun as a bilateral dispute was now expanding into a broader alignment of states, responding to perceived delegitimization of a member nation. Inside the United States, reaction fractured. Partisan divisions emerged immediately, but a separate fault line cut across them whether American power includes the right to publicly redefine allied nations. That question did not map cleanly onto party affiliation, and it exposed internal disagreement about the limits of rhetoric in statecraft. Warren Buffett later framed the distinction that had become central to the escalation. Conflicts over interests, he noted, are negotiable. They involve trade-offs, pricing, and compromise. But conflicts over identity are not. When you attack interests, he said, you begin a negotiation. When you attack identity, you end up somewhere else entirely. He emphasized that Canada's initial responses had been interest-based tariffs, adjustments, diversifications. But the moment identity was targeted directly, the nature of the response changed. It became immediate, unified, and non-negotiable. Identity, unlike interest, does not calculate cost in the same way. It does not search for equilibrium. It seeks restoration. From that point, escalation became self-reinforcing. Boycotts emerged spontaneously. Political statements multiplied across allied governments. Markets adjusted not only to policy shifts, but to uncertainty about the durability of established frameworks. Buffett's conclusion was direct. Once dignity becomes the center of a conflict, traditional negotiation structures lose effectiveness. There is no midpoint between recognition and dismissal. The question that remained was not economic, but structural. What happens when a trade dispute ceases to be about trade at all? because at that point, agreements can be canceled, tariffs can be imposed, alliances can be tested. But identity, once invoked, does not return quietly to the background. It persists, and so does the response it generates.